Well, first of all, thanks very much for coming. I appreciate how busy you all are and how much sort of pull there is on your time. So thanks for taking some time out to come and listen to me. I'm going to be talking for about, rather dauntingly, about half an hour, maybe even a bit longer than that. And the areas I'm going to cover are some of them are quite subtle. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you for your attention for quite a lot of it. It's not a lot of pretty pictures of buildings, although there are a few of those. It's about thinking. That's what I'm trying to open your mind up today. So let's get, anytime you want to ask a question, just put your hand up and I'll stop and have a chat, or there's a Q&A session at the end. But if there's something that's burning and you don't really understand what I'm saying, or I'm going too fast or anything like that, then just let me know and I'll stop and I'll try and explain. Right. So, before I start, so you mentioned you are on the MEng course, is that right?
MSc, Environmental Design and Engineering, most of them.
Okay.
One health, well-being and sustainable buildings, and one smart buildings and digital engineering, which is strongly engineering program. Okay. And so hands up those people who are wanting to explore a future career in the built environment. Fantastic, right. And then hands up those who, this might be a little bit unfair in terms of where you are, but hands up those who have thought a little bit about their career journey going forward. This isn't a trick question, you don't have to put your hand up if you don't want to. And hands up those who would understand, for example, the word and the importance of culture in an organisation. Anybody thought about that at all? Maybe. Right, okay. Right. Okay, so what's the series of talks? As Diane said, there's 5, actually not 6. I'm giving the first one. What is it trying to achieve? It's trying to give you, as Diane said, a bit of a real world coverage of what the industry's like, as opposed to the academic world that you're in at the moment, like I was back in the day. And it's also aimed to do nothing other than encourage you to come, because honestly this industry is fantastic. In my personal experience, it's been really, really good for me. I've really enjoyed almost every single day of it, and I hope you will too. But my passion is about making you, when you come into the industry, to be as effective as you can be, as early as you can be. Because in my world, it took me an awful long time, I don't quite know why, and we'll cover that a little bit later on, to become effective. And honestly, I just want to pass as much wisdom as I can to you to actually allow you to be effective as quickly as you can. And that's really what this is all about. And by effective, I mean getting things actually physically done, rather than knowing what needs to be done, but actually implementing it. And that, in my experience, is one of the hardest things to do. So any wisdom I can pass on to you, I hope that will help you on your journey. Hopefully that makes sense. So how are we going to do that? Well, it's not just me with all the wisdom. I'm retired, I should have said that at the start. So I've been through my career. I'm still doing things like this. I'll come on to that a little bit later on. But I picked up an awful lot of wisdom along my sort of 45-year journey. And it's not just me. So I know lots of other people, because I've been in this industry for so long, who also have lots of wisdom, different bits of wisdom than I've got. And I basically pulled together some people who are all just as passionate as I am about passing that wisdom on. And it's all different stuff. So you'll get a great opportunity to pick up wisdom from lots of different people. And as I say there, we're all on your side. You know, we're all doing this because we really want you to be a success. Trust me. So who's going to talk? So alongside me today, I've chosen people who are cover a very wide variety of bits of industry. So I was an MEP engineer. So Joe Thornton, who's next week, who I absolutely urge you to come along to, is a quantity surveyor. So I don't know how much you know about quantity surveyors, but quantity surveyors basically control the money. And money is super important in a project. Now, I don't know how much exposure you have to money in your academic career, things like cost plans, budgets, what happens if the budget is exceeded, how is the budget pulled together, all that sort of stuff. Now, Joe is the best QS I've ever worked with, and he's coming along to talk. So if you come to one, I would urge you to come to that one. And if you can tell all your friends, that would be good as well. Anna, who's next, I've known for 25 years. Anna was an architect with Wilkinson Eyre, one of the leading sort of niche architects in the UK. She's actually, in her career, transitioned to an engineer. Actually, she's head of one of the sustainability directors at Bureau Happold, who are a large engineering consultant. So I thought that was an interesting journey to see architecture and engineering. Ruth is one of my colleagues was one of my colleagues at Hoare Lea when I was there. She's a lighting expert, day lighting and lighting. She's actually one of the visiting lecturers on the MEng course. So she's coming along. And then finally, Matt Jones, who I've known for 35 years of my career, is probably the biggest disruptor thinker that I know. And he actually is probably number one position in Hoare Lea. So he's repositioning Hoare Lea in terms of facing up to what tomorrow and today's challenges are. And to get his insight would be really helpful as well, I think. So hopefully you've got a good package there. And I appreciate it's difficult to give up your evening on a Wednesday, especially when it's bonfire night. But honestly, I would urge you, when I was your age, I would have absolutely lapped up this, because this is a one-off opportunity to get some really good advice. Equally, I should say that I think that, but it'd be very interesting to get your view on this. So maybe at the end we can just have a little bit of a chat around how much benefit this actually was for you, as opposed to what I think it should be for you, because that could tailor some of the future talks. Okay, so why the focus on getting things done? Well, other than the obvious question, why not? Maybe there's something about, I always got a buzz when I got things done, so there's some sort of fulfillment, enjoyment, so the obvious things. But if you think about a very real example of why I'm pushing you away from, or in addition to knowing what to do, to actually doing it, here's a very real example, which is our climate emergency. So you probably all know this, but the UK and most of the rest of the world in various different ways, shapes or form, have all signed up to decarbonising all of the built environment by 2050. Sometimes it's 2045, sometimes it's 2060, whatever. But it's broadly that direction of travel. And I think there's roughly 20 million buildings in the UK. So you can imagine how much that is in, around the world. So we've got 20 plus million buildings to decarbonise by 2050, which is 25 years away. So 20 million buildings. 20 million buildings. And I reckon we're somewhere in the region of 0.01% of that journey being completed, which is almost embarrassing. In fact, all of the speakers, the series has been running for a couple of years now. All of the speakers I ask, how many buildings has your practice actually delivered at net zero carbon? And honestly, it's rather embarrassing. First of all, they say, lots. Well, actually, we don't really measure it. Well, one or two. And we're all the same. I'm not blaming anybody. It just hasn't latched. So why is that? 25 years to go. So when you come out into your world of work, that's a massive challenge that you've got to grasp. So what's the problem with that? Why isn't it being done? And there's loads of different reasons, and I'm not really going to go through all of these. It's not about finding the reasons, but there's lots of people telling you even now that, I know what needs to be done, but I'll confuse the issue. There's not much effectiveness, achievement, getting things done. It's 0.01%, so there's a big challenge. So why? Well, money is one of the reasons, because decarbonising 20 million buildings is going to cost an awful lot of money. One of the things I'll come on to later, I'm working with Oxford University in attempting to shift their way at which they decarbonise buildings. They've got 240 buildings in their estate, lots of old buildings, lots of massive laboratory buildings. They reckon it's $750 million to decarbonise their buildings. So it's a lot of money, so we can't ignore that. There's a lot of money. But also, one of the things I've learned along the way is that change is a really difficult thing to grasp onto. So change is difficult. So switching away from what you did yesterday to doing something different tomorrow to decarbonise buildings, even though it sounds a relatively simple thing, is very frightening for a lot of people. They'd much rather do what they used to do and what they did yesterday, because that's familiar. Doing something different tomorrow is a real problem, and our industry, and perhaps even all industries, but our industry in particular, has been very, very slow to adapt to that change. And I don't really know why, but it sort of bugged me when I was going through my career, which is one of the reasons why I'm here. So change is difficult. There's an awful lot of lack of self-belief. I think the construction industry doesn't really believe itself at times. You know, it's not very sexy as an industry. It's really challenging to make your mark. You feel as though you're a foot soldier all the time. There's something around that. And as I say, everybody quite likes doing what they did yesterday because that's familiar and comfortable. And despite everybody talking about a climate emergency, it's still a relatively difficult thing to define in terms of what the challenge is. What does net zero really mean? And how do you measure it? And who measures it and all that sort of stuff. And slightly worrying from my point of view as well, there's a sort of a rise in sort of the last 12 months of climate emergency skeptics who, and I sort of worry slightly that if we're not careful, just as we get started, we're going to be destabilised because somebody in central government is going to say, well, we're not going to focus on 2050 because we can't afford it or whatever. There's a very real need, and we've got to stick to it. And again, society. My learnt experience over 45 years is always very difficult to start something new. So those are some of the issues about why it's so easy not to focus on it. So I think I and we and everybody I think in this industry needs you to be able to resolve those issues as quickly as you can when you come out into your world of work, because the last thing we want is another set of people telling everybody what they need to do. We actually want people to do it. That's what I mean by effective. Okay? If you could latch on to that. And of course, my example is about decarbonisation, but basically, in my experience, tells me that if you are effective at anything you do in your career, that will be a really, really good thing to have under your belt. So it's not. Don't just think this is about decarbonisation. It's not. The other strand I could have used here is about the productivity of the construction industry. UK PLC is, and probably most countries in the world, are all grappling with their productivity, because the more productive the country is, the more money there is. So there's more social care, and there's more education, and there's more defence spending, whatever it is. So productivity is a massive driver. And the UK construction industry is very underproductive. It lacks production. It lacks production capability. It lacks being productive. Mainly because everybody carries on doing what they did yesterday rather than think about how we can evolve that and rationalise that. So that could be another reason why it would be hugely advantageous for you to be effective, and as effective as you can be as soon as you can be. So it's a very, very useful thing to have, and it will be very helpful to you in your career going forward. Trust me. So I thought to try and tell a story about effectiveness, I sort of whizzed through my own career, because during my career journey, I've picked up nuggets of things that help. Come on in and sit yourselves down.
Sorry,
Don't worry. I fell foul of the same thing. So I'm here to try and pass on my wisdom in that area, as much of that as I can do to you, and I'll use the vehicle of my career to try and pass some of that on. Hopefully that makes sense. So gathering wisdom, it's not like, if only this were the case, that on day one of your career you could be put into a dark room and the door closed and all the wisdom was injected into your brain, and that was it. It'd be fantastic. Wouldn't that be really, really good? But in reality, of course, is that wisdom is picked up throughout your working life, and it's not a linear line. You don't learn more at the start than you do at the end. Interestingly enough, I actually learned more wisdom at the end of my career than at the start. So I'm going to have to take you through the whole journey, but I'll do this as quickly as I can. So I've broken my career down into four chunks: my university career, my practicing MEP consulting engineer career, which is the green bit. And then I was lucky enough to find myself in a sort of a senior leadership position at Hoare Lea, so that's the orange bit. And then when I retired in 2020, it's my post-retirement bit, because that's also quite interesting as well. And actually that's when lots of my wisdom has started to come together, it's been quite interesting for me as well. So let's look at each of those things. So I was at university at Bath, which at the time was a groundbreaking undergrad course, because it taught architects or structural engineers with MEP engineers, which is broadly like what's happening here, certainly on the MEng course. And that was fantastic, really, really good for me. It was multidisciplinary, it was a sandwich course, so you spent a bit of time in industry during the summer. Going to university for me was frightening. You know, I was a very quiet, very shy person when I was 18, and going to a university and meeting lots of other people was really, really daunting, but I stuck with it. The course was great because it was 50% studio-based and then 50% lectures. So there was lots of drawing and stuff. I liked doing all of that sort of stuff, so that was really interesting. But we did lots of interdisciplinary project work. So twice a year we formed ourselves into little teams, so we had structures working with architects, working with MEP, which is really, really useful in terms of what happens in the real world. And then one of the things that I learned very, very early on is that different disciplines think in a different way. You know, even students who've just come to be architects think totally differently from people who come to university to do engineering. I remember one particular crit session where we'd all been given a project to do. I think it was like designing a different leisure centre or something, I don't know. All the engineers had been up all night doing schematics and sizing chillers and whatever. And the architects were just sort of sat around drinking coffee and talking. And one of the architects presented, we'd all got these drawings, presented a piece of crochet, which she convinced the tutors was actually the way the design process has come together, all that sort of stuff. And I realised then that if you want to work in construction where it's all about interdisciplinary work, my challenge was to understand how architects thought, and actually to be able to communicate with them in a way that was uncomfortable for me but latched on to them. So that's a little example. Lots of imparting of technical skills when I was at university, just like you know, how to do things and whatever. Limited connectivity with the real world, which even then I thought was a bit odd, but I was lucky enough to be able to secure a graduate position while I was in university, which was fantastic. So I went straight from university to a career. So what were the bits of stuff that even then, subconsciously in my mind, I was beginning to pick up? They're all framed in yellow, so they're easy for you to pick up. Don't worry, I'll recap all of these at the end because there's quite a lot, but I'll go through it. So number one lesson for me at university is it's never you, it's a team. Because nobody really in industry does anything on their own. It's about working together. That's a key learning. And because of that, because of the different way people think, communication, both written and verbal, any sort of communication is absolutely super important. Now, some people, communication comes to them very easy. It never did to me. So I've had to work hard at being good at that. And everybody's different. You know, some people struggle with communication. I get all of that. All I'm saying is recognize that that's important and try and find a way of improving your ability to communicate, because that will be super, super important. That's one of the top 5 little yellow boxes in my mind. And then also, it pays. I just couldn't stop being curious about things. I wanted to know how it worked and why they didn't work and whatever. So, but remaining curious after your academic career is critical. So I did a lot of that at university, and I wouldn't say I got very good at it. I mean, I was never very good at anything, to be honest, but that was something that I really enjoyed, and it's been very useful going forward. And I had a big dollop of luck, and no two ways about that. I was lucky enough to find it. I actually didn't know it was a joint course before I arrived, so it's just one of those things that was lucky, and I was lucky enough to get a job straight away. So luck plays a big part, and that's the way it is. So here's a sort of a snapshot of my consulting engineering career. So I started in 1984, and by the time I got to the year 2000, so 16 years later, I was promoted to a partner, and I'll cover that. That's my sort of senior leadership thing, which is the next stage. But I sort of put on a purple line of effectiveness, and by effectiveness I mean actually taking ownership of something and actually getting it done. And it took ages for me to get going. I mean, you look at the line, it's almost flat. So I started as a graduate where I was sort of basically, sit in the corner and draw some radiators or whatever it was. And my career progress was very slow. It took me, 6 years to become a chartered engineer. Now, I think probably most people would do that in 3 or 4 nowadays. There was no training at Hoare Lea, the company I joined, because nobody did any training back in the 80s. You just learned from everybody. There were 70 people in my office. If you were good at communication, you talked to 70 people and you picked lots of stuff up. That's how I developed. And I sort of look back now and think, well, why did it take me so long? And I think part of it was because the person who was responsible for promoting me and giving me that confidence to think bigger and whatever, I don't think they understood the way the system worked either. So it wasn't a fault of Hoare Lea. I think that was just a generational thing back in the 80s. But anyway, it took me so long. And basically the sort of microcosm of what I'm trying to say to you is, if we can shift that curve for you back so it's quicker, you will benefit, everybody will benefit. So what were the nuggets I picked up along the way? Absolutely, find an employer with a good training program, and I think you'd struggle to find one that didn't offer that nowadays. But there's training and there's engagement with training, and there's being passive with training. So if you are lucky enough to get an employer and they've got a good scheme, absolutely latch onto it and make the most of it, because it will be very, very useful for you. As I say, remain curious, focus on your communication skills. Once you've got that, once all those things are starting to come together, you have to find your voice. So, what I mean by that is that for those 16 years, I was looking after projects, increasingly big projects, bundles of projects. My role was to go to a meeting with the rest of the team or the client, say as little as possible, cover the bit that I was prepared to, I'd done the work on, MEP engineering. If there was a conversation about procurement or structures or anything, I would be totally passive, because I just wanted to go, deliver my bit, and come back again. Actually, that's wrong. If you've got knowledge on anything, you should find your voice and trust yourself to. Because if I was the client, I kept on thinking that, if I was the client and I was paying for all these specialists, I'd actually want all of that information, not just the bit that they, it's sort of logical when you think of it from a client's point of view. But that comes with confidence. Once you've got your confidence and you're good at communication, then you should find your voice, and do that as early as you can. And then another nugget that I picked up as well is, you might think that when you go and join a firm, they will look after you and they will drive your career. Well, some of them do, but actually equally, and I say this to anybody who'll listen, take some time, not loads of time, not like every Wednesday, but just take some time to think about how the firm that you work for is driving your career. And maybe you're not comfortable with that. Maybe it's a bit too quick. Maybe it's a bit too slow. Maybe you want more opportunities. Once you've found your voice, that's a really useful way of engaging with your line managers, in an annual appraisal or whatever it was. Just try and dial up your confidence. And also, I made loads of mistakes in my career. I'm surprised I'm still here. But learn from those mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. There's no, as my ex-boss used to say to me when I'd trot up to his office and say I've made another mistake, he'd say, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Is anybody going to die? nobody was going to die if I got the chiller wrong or whatever. So learn from your mistakes. So loads of buildings, offices, hospitals, libraries, one of my personal favourites. My favourite ever building, educational building in Oxford. 16th century, 12th century college chapel extensions, data centres, even museums, lots and lots of research buildings, R&D, science and research stuff I specialised in towards the end of my career, so lots of that. So lots and lots of buildings. So if you sort of think about that, I did a quick sum. I reckon over those 16 years I worked on 250 different projects. Loads and loads of projects. Surprisingly enough, almost every single building was a different client. There were some serial clients, but almost every building is a different client across lots of different sectors, and there's lots and lots of things to learn from those, because a hospital is totally different from a school, totally different from a prison, for example. And then also, actually, interestingly enough, and again, maybe you don't understand that, but when I say I've worked with 75 architects, I don't mean 75 architects, I mean 75 architectural practices. So, and 80 different structural engineering firms, and probably 100 different project managers, and probably 50 different construction people. And I reckon roughly around 5,000 different people that I've been working with that I'd never met before, probably would never work with again, all thrown together by a client I'd never worked with before, in a team that was supposed to function perfectly well to get a good outcome. I mean, that's sort of, in a way, I used to really thrive on that, because by then I'd sort of developed my communication skills, and I used to enjoy it. But some people are so daunted by that they can't function, and yet we need to function because we need to deliver the project. So again, what are the things that I would pick out of that? As I say, it's never you, it's a team thing. Communication. Remain curious. Here's something that I only picked up probably in the last 10 years. Towards the end of my career as a consulting engineer, I was on a building awards panel. So I used to go around buildings in the UK with a judging team. We used to see 20 buildings and then try and find the best. Really, really good way of finding out what's happening in the world, meeting lots of different clients, seeing lots of different buildings. But it struck me that after a while doing that, good clients, by which I mean clients who are switched on, have a clear understanding of what they want, have engaged with their design team, are enthusiastic and supportive, and are committed, good clients always get good buildings. And sadly, the reverse is also true. Clients who aren't necessarily as switched on as the others, they generally get mediocre buildings. And I thought to myself, well, why is that? I've got the youngest person I've ever seen attend one of my lectures. He must be 6. There's a really interesting fact that good clients get good buildings. So what makes a client good? Well, maybe some of that is because they've really engaged with their team and they are getting the right level of advice from everybody. It makes them good. So, it sort of validates my thing about find your voice, engage, be confident, deliver what the client wants. A really interesting thing that struck me quite late in my career. So the other thing that starts to come in while you're practicing is the power of money, the power of finance. And I'll say it again, Joe Thornton next week, a plug, come along and listen, because that's really helpful. The sooner you understand, I've worked with loads of architects along the way who would say, but what do you mean I can't have the facade I want? And the QSs say, well, there's only 50 million in the cost plan. We can't afford the facade. But. So if you can switch that round to say, I know the QS has only got 50 million. I know how much my component costs. I will be clever enough to design it once and design it so that it doesn't cost more than 50 million. That's the best way to deliver something. It's productive, it's rewarding, you don't have to constantly redesign. if engineers generally do that, but architects generally don't, I would say. So understand the power of finance and money. Have confidence in yourself. I would say that the majority of people that I know at Hoare Lea and have met in my career have been probably lacking in self-confidence, which is a surprising statistic, but actually I think that's one of the things that is symptomatic of the fact that our industry is not very good at being innovative and is not as productive as it should be, and actually is not being better at being effective. So self-confidence is a really important factor. In your communication, you also have to dial up your emotional intelligence as well as your intellectual intelligence, because communication isn't just saying something to somebody and then them giving you something back. It's about understanding what they mean when they say something back. It's being empathetic. It's being intelligent enough to think around what they're saying. Maybe they don't understand the exact words. Maybe they don't understand engineering language, yet they're giving you a brief. So interrogate that. So emotional intelligence is super, super critical. And as I say, find and use your voice and make time to focus on your development. I think that's it. Right. Okay, so at the end of my practicing career, I became a partner, and I spent 20 years in what I would laughingly call senior leadership, but it's effectively, running the firm. In my case, in year 2000, I became a partner, and at that stage, the firm had probably 50 partners, probably about 750 people. And then by 2006, I must have been relatively good at what I did because I was given a bit more equity, became an equity partner, so I had sort of some skin in the game in the business. And then of those 20, there was an elected set of 5 that actually did the running of the business. And I was lucky enough to be in that position. I was one of the 5 from roughly 2010 onwards, so 10 years in that role. And you can see that my effectiveness, I think, from my own interest, whether my boss would agree with that at the time, I'm not sure, but my effectiveness increased as I got further up the equity ladder, until it was at its peak, which is slightly frustrating. You spend your entire career waiting to get effectiveness, and you get it just before you retire, which is a bit frustrating, but never mind. So I spent lots of time doing projects, so I morphed from being a technical designer to a leader, I guess. So the projects that I picked up and covered at that stage were actually mainly inward focusing, very complicated, and you might find this surprising, but actually much, much more complicated than designing a very complicated building, because basically they involve people, and people are complex, and working with people is complex. Hugely challenging, but absolutely rewarding. Some of the most exciting things I've ever done, I've done in this period of my career. So I'll just quickly whiz through those, because I think they are relevant as well in terms of the effectiveness diagram. So I'll quickly whiz through. There's 3 or 4, so it shouldn't take too long. So one of the first things I did, again, this is quite interesting. So when I became a partner, it just so happened that that stage, UK PLC was interested in science buildings all of a sudden. So there was more money flowing into the system. There were more clients who wanted to build laboratories in lots of different things, quantum computing, vaccine research, all that sort of stuff. So the market was saying to us, who were selling into the market, we need more science designers. So we had to grow the capacity of the team. So we had to headhunt, we had to develop some of our own people in a certain direction. And we were very successful at that. That's quite a challenging job. It was one of the toughest things I ever did, actually, is to try and recruit good people. But what we discovered along the way, relatively soon after that journey, is that we actually had more knowledge about science buildings than most of the clients who were building them. Because if you think about it, if you're a client, you've probably fallen into that job. There aren't very many professional clients in the world. So maybe there's a developer who wants to build a very large laboratory building in Oxford for some tenants that he thinks might come along. He doesn't really understand science. He doesn't really understand what the end users might want. actually we are the people who know much more than the client. So if you think about it, if we hadn't found our own voice, we would have designed the wrong building for the client who had asked us the wrong questions. And we sort of got fed up in a very friendly sort of way for being asked by clients to do things which we knew were wrong. So we sort of, by accident in a way, found that we were moving up arguably what you could call the food chain. So we were talking directly to clients as the knowledgeable person. So we were, and that was quite, if you think about that, that's sort of relatively sensible thing to do. If you've got more knowledge than your client, why would you not approach them as an equal? But because Hoare Lea and the industry lacked self-confidence, it was actually quite hard to get our people to do that. So we had to re-engineer the way people thought and dial up their self-confidence. So that took a long time. And along with that, there was also a lot of content generation, thought leadership stuff, which in a way validated our position in the market, I guess. And that was a really interesting voyage to go on. And as a whole, we probably, in 5 years, probably less than that, in 3 years, we probably doubled the number of people we had in science, and we probably tripled our turnover. And I mean, that was, a fantastically successful thing to do. And it's not just about money. We were designing and building perhaps the most complex science buildings in the UK. All amazing. And that came from a desire to do something. So that's a really good example. Again, so it's absolutely not about me, it's about the team. You have to remain curious about what you're doing, what you're learning. Communication is obviously super important yet again. Find your voice, embrace change. So that's just spend 2 seconds on that. In my career, the pace of change is significantly slower than it will be in your career. So in my experience, again, there are people who are absolutely frightened about change and will run away from it. And equally, there are some, not very many, but there are some who will actually run towards change and think of it as a real positive opportunity to do something different. If you're a leader, you have to be in the latter category, because change is coming all the time in our industry, like it is in every industry. So understanding earlier on that you should embrace and welcome change will really help you in your career. Definitely. Emotional intelligence, self-confidence, and lastly, a determination to achieve, because these things take, just that slide there took 4 years. And there are loads and loads and loads of setbacks along the way. Somebody you thought would be a really good hire said yes and then said no. Some project you were chasing was cancelled. There's lots and lots of setbacks happen all the time, but learn from your mistakes if you've made any mistakes and keep going and be absolutely dogged to get to the end. Another example, as an engineering firm, we were full of people who were creative. Creativity is what you do every day. But because we'd begun this journey to not reinvent, but modify where we were in the world, to be not a provider of a service, but what we would call a trusted advisor to a client. So we were further up the food chain. Not because we thought there was more money in that or anything, but we thought that's where we should be, because that's where there was a need for us. I thought, well, what we should do is we should be much more innovative. So I set off on a journey. This is one of my classic mistakes. Set off on a journey for probably about 3 years to try and dial up the innovation that happened at Hoare Lea. And it was really difficult, because time and time I'd stand up and do things like this and go and see different offices and encourage them. And it just wouldn't work. It was just like landing on people that didn't really understand. And I was, what could I do? And then I realised actually that to change something like that, you needed to dial up the culture. You needed to recognise that innovation isn't something you do at between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock on a Friday. Innovation is something that sits within the culture of what you do all the time. So I was thinking that it was about a process, because I'm an engineer. I thought to get more innovation happening at Hoare Lea. I needed to design a process to allow that to happen. But it wasn't that at all. It was about changing the culture. So if you work hard at the culture and you remind people all the time that actually what we really love you to do and what you enjoy doing yourself is being innovative, just do a bit more of that, have some fun with it, or that's when you get innovation for free. Whereas I've been looking at it the wrong way. So as a classic case of my getting something wrong, we got there in the end, but it took about 4 years too long. And actually culture even more important in my mind. I mean, I would say that probably the thing that I focus on most as a thing that will make you as effective as you can be is to understand culture. Better than anything else, better than money, better than resources, but culture is so important. Yet as an engineer, I had no language to talk about culture because I didn't really understand it. I'd never had any training in it, never learned anything on it. It's just something that I picked up. Another thing that I was asked to lead was the rebranding of Hoare Lea. We had a very successful brand, but as I say, we were sort of morphing our way into being a trusted advisor rather than a seller of design services. So we thought that we should we thought that we should have our external brand and our internal brand reflect that. So that was a really interesting process to go through. I mean, obviously, one of the things that I probably enjoyed doing the most. Again, I had no experience in branding. So it's about finding people who you can trust to work with you. And that's, so here's an example of explore that Diane was saying earlier on. So, some people might say, in fact, we had people in our firm that said, why would we want to write a thought leadership book and give it to our clients? Why do you want to do that? Well, why wouldn't we want to do it? Because we've got lots of interesting things to say. We've got lots of interesting people with lots of interesting things to say. And why would you not want to tell your clients about that? But that's a perfect example of how it was actually quite difficult to get 1,000 people at that stage to think in that sort of way, and it's a very subtle process because culture is very subtle. And again, I'll come on to that in a bit later. But we got there in the end, and that was really successful. And we do a thought leadership thing every year where we bring 200 of our best clients, and we have 5 or 6 different people, some from Hoare Lea, some from industry, some from academia, come and do some really interesting thought leadership talks. Very success, absolutely superb, great fun. And it's all about culture, because culture is very difficult to define. But if I was asked what culture, I would say culture is about the sort of soul of an organisation. It's about how it thinks. It's about what its values are. It's a very subtle thing, but all successful cultures have to be authentic. They can't be false. So if you're telling somebody over here, an external client, that you're like this as an organisation, and then you behave like that, it just doesn't work. So it has to be authentic. So it's a very subtle thing. It takes years and years and years to build, which we did. And absolutely, definitely, if you're a leader of an organisation, you have to wear that culture all the time. You have to live and breathe it. And every single decision you make has to be seen through a cultural lens, because it's very vulnerable. As an example, you've grown your organisation to 1,000 people, the market drops, what do? Do you sack 100 people? Culturally, is that right? Why didn't you just try and persuade all our employees to take a 2% pay drop or whatever? Keep all those people, explain why the process, that's absolutely an example of why culture is so powerful. So again, I would say culture it's an interesting thing. So when I was going back through my 16 years of consulting engineering, there were 2 or 3 projects that I thought of instantly that I enjoyed. And I couldn't quite work out why they were so enjoyable. It wasn't because they necessarily had a great client. It's just because everybody in the team, architect, QS, construction, everybody thought the same. Everybody instantly fitted and gelled. And it wasn't until I got to this stage in my career that I realised that the word I was thinking of, I was trying to find, was culture. The culture of that team was absolutely right. we used to have cake baking sessions. So at a design team meeting, the QS used to make the first cake. I used to make the second cake. You know, and that's just a tiny example of how the culture thing, when you get it, is so powerful, because everybody works together because they want to work together to get the absolute best outcome for the client, and they enjoy it, and that's why it's stuck in my mind. So culture is super important. Here's a really interesting example. This is, again, something that came into my mind, not just me, but a group of us at the time, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. These are the sort of big chunks of a business, any university, consulting firm. There's people, there's projects. If you're lucky enough to have projects, you've got some clients. The clients will give you some money, so that's fees. And if you organise the whole process right, you get profit. And of course, some people think profit is a dirty word. It absolutely, definitely is not, because unless there's any profit, it doesn't pay for everything else, all the development. Now, even though nobody had ever when I became a senior leader, we didn't really have talks about this sort of stuff. But in my mind, I don't know why that was, I thought it was all run that way. Profit, let's focus on the profit. Let's focus on making sure the fees are big enough to give us some profit. Let's make sure the clients are good enough to pay some decent fees. Let's show we get lots of good projects which will hopefully have good fee levels with good clients. And last at the end was, oh yeah, we need some people to do the work. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I suddenly realised that actually it's the other way around. If you get the culture right, if you absolutely invest in your people, so they're the very, very best they can be, as soon as they possibly can be, they will find projects, because good people are attracted to projects. The chances are those projects will have really, really good clients. I've told you about how important good clients are. If you have a good client on a good project, the chances are they will pay you the right fee, a proper fee. And if you get lots of proper fees, you get profit, and you get profit for nothing. If you invest all your effort from the left to right rather than the right to left, it's brilliant. And of course, that's all about culture. So yet another reason why the culture word comes up again. So after 20 years as a partner, I was lucky enough to retire. And then what have I been doing since then? Well, I did some coaching and mentoring work for Hoare Lea in our Oxford office, which I was attached to. I'll quickly talk about that. I'm doing some work at UCL for Dan. I'm doing it because I love it rather than being paid. And I'm doing some interesting work at Oxford, which begins to knit together all these little boxes, so I thought I'd quickly talk to you about that. So yeah, coaching and mentoring. We didn't have any coaching and mentoring in the firm, and when I retired, there was a situation where emerging leaders were being asked to emerge slightly earlier than perhaps they should have been, for an accident of promotions and people leaving or whatever. So I saw an opportunity, I saw a need for those leaders to be upskilled relatively quickly. So I thought the method of doing that was coaching and mentoring. I have absolutely no professional knowledge of coaching and mentoring, but it seemed to me the right thing to do to actually instigate a process for that. Really, really rewarding. We started with 2, spread out to 15, and then expanded that to 70. So the 70 people in the 2 offices that I was involved in, they all actually receive mentoring and give mentoring. And one of the things that stood out for me, unbelievable learning, was that actually if you give mentoring, it's almost more rewarding than receiving it. It's such a powerful culture-defining thing. And that's taken off, which is really good. And one of the interesting things we had a chat with Diane about is whether we could do something, expand that process at UCL. It'd be quite interesting to do. So all about culture. And of course, you need to find your voice. You need to be authentic. You have to be 100% authentic to do coaching. It's about embracing change because it's something new. Am I good enough to give coaching? Lots of people ask that. Well, of course you are. Determination to achieve, because this is something new and change is difficult. And it's never you, it's a team thing. So I didn't do the coaching and mentoring. I enabled that to happen, and I worked hard to make sure it happened. And it's about, again, being curious and learning. So at UCL, so as I say, I'm here to try and make you as good as you can be, as quickly as you can be. I provide some real-world industry overview to the Year 1 students on the MEng course about how the design process works. And I created this, along with others, this wisdom sharing talk. It's now into its 3rd year. And what else could I do? Well, one of the things that I'm interested about is, because my role is industry liaison, interestingly enough, to academics, if you ask them what industry was, they say, well, it's probably those 3 in the middle, MEP, structures and architecture, and maybe lighting, maybe acoustics, maybe in use, maybe data analysts. But actually, I know that the industry is much, much broader than that. And through my sort of connectivity with industry, which again I fell into because I was constantly curious, there's all these people at the bottom who are actually all doing really, really groundbreaking work, absolutely inextricably linked to the success of all the projects you'll be working on. Those people never really have a voice. So I think there's some real opportunity to bring more of that to to you and to academia. So if there is a series of talks next year, then I'm certainly going to plumb that blue band to try and get some more people, because I know lots and lots and lots of people who are all really passionate about design and about construction and about the industry in that blue area, and I know for a fact they are all looking for graduates, and they're all struggling to find graduates. So here we've got lots of graduates, so if you can mix those two together, that would be a win-win, hopefully. So that's maybe something for the future. So very quickly finishing off then at Oxford University. So I was lucky enough to, how did it start? The Designing the Future thing, that thought leadership thing I mentioned earlier on. One of the roles I had when I retired was to go and find speakers. And we really liked to have some academics. So we had a project that had just finished in Oxford, and the client was an academic. He was a really interesting guy. I didn't know him. He was what you would call a good client. The project was really successful, and he was engaged with it, and he was passionate about it. I went to see him afterwards on the pretext of having a conversation about how the project went. Little did I know that he was waiting to pounce on me. So he had just been appointed to one of the faculties at Oxford to lead that. Probably the biggest faculty at Oxford University, so it's maths, physics and life sciences. So all the things you can think of that people know Oxford for, like vaccines and quantum computing and whatever, he was leading all of that. And he was a serial client. He'd done 2 or 3 buildings, various different universities he'd worked in along the way in his career. And he said to me, look, why is your industry so rubbish? He said, I see you doing exactly the same as you did 20 years ago. You don't do any innovation. You just moan about the fact that there's no money. It takes you so long to design and build a building. And if I'm lucky, I get broadly what I wanted in the first place. Why is that happening? Why are you all in these silos? And it's absolutely true. Again, you might not know that, but all those people on there in that band, they don't really talk to each other. It's just, nobody's stopping them doing it, but they just don't, because they're too busy doing their day job. And they all moan about the fact that their silo is all rubbish. There's not enough fees, I can't get enough work, there's too much competition, clients are asking me to price too much. They're all happy to moan, but none of them will change it. It's so challenging for me. And then below that, you've got another set of people. So the blue band that I mentioned earlier, they're all the people who are actually designing all these light fittings for a market they think is going to sell, and the radiators and the ventilation systems and the cladding and the windows, and the people who put it all together. They're all moaning. They're all in their own silos. They're all moaning that there's absolutely no money in contracting, and people going bust all the time, and why does the client never talk to me, and why are my contractual terms so unfair? And then you've got a third layer, which is all the academics. So at Oxford, after I'd met my client, he invited me to lunch, which was slightly daunting because I was the only non-professor, well, honorary professor, but not real professor. He had 6 academics who were leading research faculties at Oxford in areas like low energy cooling, carbon accounting, battery storage, PV design, sensor technology, world-leading academics that were living in buildings that I designed for them 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, and I had no idea that they were doing that sort of work. And they, in their silos, were moaning about the fact that in academia I can never engage with the construction, with the real world. It's just like an academic exercise. What I really want is to engage with industry. Yeah, I don't know how to do it. And you think, well, there's those three silos that never talk to each other and to each other, as it were. So across that way and down that way. So we set off to try and bring a representative, or as many representatives as we could think of, from those silos together in a room, provide tea and biscuits and sandwiches, and we just had a big conversation, which lasted most of the day. And it was full of, oh, if only this, and why doesn't that, and the really interesting thing was, almost to a man and a woman, they were all broadly saying the same thing. Whichever silo they were in, that way or that way, they all were unhappy that they couldn't engage with each other, they were unhappy that the finance didn't work, and they all thought that it was all right for somebody else. So the client thought it was all right for builders because they were making lots of money. The builders thought it was all right for the clients because they screwed the builder down and there was no money. You know, it was just unbelievable. It was such a powerful meeting. So what we tried to do is to actually capture all of that and establish a trust-based, cultural trust-based organisation or grouping where we could actually commit to not just moan about it, but actually commit to do something about it. And that took a while. And by this time I'd retired, so it's hard enough when you're leading an organisation, for that organisation to change, when you've got loads of skin in the game, as it were, because you're a leader in that organisation. But here, when I'd retired, I was just like a guy who turned up and sort of waved my arms around. So the speed at which this change happens is so slow, but I'm so dogged, I'm going to stick with it. So change is hard. As I say, everybody's happy to do what they did yesterday, thinking it was going to be great. What we try to do is we try to identify some areas where we could explain what good, better might look like, which engage with the right culture, with us all doing it together, with it being totally different from what we did before. And then try and look for people to support those ideas as they started to emerge. So there are probably 4 ideas that are floating around in that initiative, but the one that I'm most interested in and I'm putting most effort into is is this one. How can we decarbonise the building stock? And I picked that one because, going back to why I started in this conversation, the client I met who asked me to come along to this, who's just got this senior role at Oxford, he said to me one day, the only thing I wake up at night worrying about in this job is how the university is going to decarbonise its 240 buildings, which I thought was really interesting. I wouldn't have expected him to say that. I would have thought it would have been about finance, about student numbers, about politics, all this sort of stuff. But it was about decarbonisation. So I thought, right, why can we try and use that as an idea to get something going? So we're trying to set this up, and I'll explain that a little bit shortly. So what we're trying to do is trying to decarbonise their estate, at the same time create buildings which are better. So the easiest thing to do would be to say, well, we can decarbonise this room by turning all the lights off, but then nobody would ever come in. So you have to be a slightly silly example, but you know what I mean. You can't put some sort of decarbonisation process on a building that used to be popular by its users, and then find out that nobody likes going there because it's too cold or it's too dark or it's too oppressive or whatever. So as well as decarbonising, you actually want to make it better. So that's a double challenge. And then add value to the retail estate, the real estate portfolio that the university's got. Because at some stage when they aren't decarbonised, which is another frightening thing, quite a lot of buildings will be almost worthless. So you've got to You've got to get that bit right to hang on to your value, because you can imagine what 240 buildings in central Oxford are going to be worth in terms of capital. It's a lot of money. So why are we doing it? Well, not just compliance. There's definitely some reputational enhancement for the university if you get that right, both internally with their students and externally in terms of the way that the market is. But also for Oxford, number one, I shouldn't say this in front of Diana, but number one university globally. You know, there's some massive global leadership potential here, because it's not just Oxford who are struggling with decarbonising their university, or the whole of the world is in terms of getting this done, because nobody's done it yet. And again, annoyingly, we broadly know how to do it. It's not the engineering that's, you know, it's a combination of optimization of the system, putting some heat pumps in rather than gas boilers, maybe looking at some battery storage and some PV on the roof or on the walls, thinking about the facade, engaging with the users, asking them to switch lights off when they, you know, all that sort of stuff. So it's broadly achievable, and it's, you know, it's 70 to 80% could be done by doing that in terms of the carbon reduction, could be done with that, and then you're left with a rump bit which you're going to have to sort of offset in some way, which some people might say is sort of cheating, but you know, we broadly know what to do over a long time scale like that. So our approach was, as I say, it's what I would call a cultural consortium, culturally led consortium. So if you go back to this, all of the people who are involved in that should be in the consortium. The users, the academics who might enhance the way we're thinking of doing it, all the people who make the heat pumps and the lighting systems and the controls, the designers, the clients, all the things you need like data analytics, the money, the funder, and the installers. We're all in it together. We're all there because we want to be there. We have terms which are acceptable to all of us. There's no master and slave. We're all equal stakeholders in the idea. If you get that cultural bit right, where everybody wants to do what they are expert at doing, together, communication, a team, dialing up your confidence, all that sort of stuff, it could work. And our model is to, going back to Oxford, they haven't got $750 million to do this. If whatever money they've got, they need to build new buildings. So how can we fund that in a different way? So we reckon 20 to 30% of the actual cost of that $750 million could come from energy saving, but the rest has to come from somewhere. So our model is to borrow that from the market and then get the university to pay us back on a monthly basis over 10 years, which is a big, I wouldn't use the word gamble, but it's a bit of a risk but if you've got all the right people in the consortium, you know it's going to work. And we're actually, it's taken a long time, but we're actually quite up there with terms of getting people in our consortium. So we're I wouldn't say we're off and running, but we're very close to off and running. And one thing I was talking to Diane earlier on, so I probably had 2 meetings that jump out at me in trying to establish that consortium. I had a meeting with a lighting manufacturer, and because I was a mechanical design engineer, I never really did lighting, so I didn't really understand who they were, whatever. But they're British and they're part of a European consortium, and they were really switched on about carbon, embodied carbon, about the fact that the best way from a total carbon point of view, if you wanted to relight this room, wouldn't be to rip out these lights and start and put their product in. They'd actually take all the bulbs out and all the control gear and put it back in and reuse all of that. From an embodied carbon, it would be much more efficient. They'd done all of that journey. They were super good at that. Much further ahead than Hoare Lea were, for example. And then the next day, we had a meeting with a UK-based heat pump manufacturer who was really good at providing very efficient heat pumps, but was daunted by the fact that they were going to have to go through this whole embodied carbon journey. And I said, well, what you really want to do is you want to go and talk to that lighting guy, because he's got so much experience and he's very happy to pass all that on. And you can sort of suddenly see how these silos begin to break down, and the power of that is phenomenal. I mean, it really is. So we've got all of these people more or less there. We've got a few spots to fill, but we're going to be off on a journey. And what's this all about? It's about all of those things that I've said. It's about embracing change. It's about being dogged, about sticking to getting determination to achieve, self-confidence, authenticity, find your voice, remain curious, all those sort of things. So it's about culture as well. So that's more or less the end. But just to recap. So these are the things that I've mentioned. These are communication is absolutely one of the top. Team thing, curious, make time for your own development, find your own voice, embrace change, good clients, attract as many of those as you can and understand what makes them good clients, understand about finance, learn from your mistakes, have confidence, dial up your emotional intelligence, be 100% authentic, be absolutely dogged to determination to achieve, and then absolutely culture. And there's a dose of luck in there as well. But just to finish on the culture, I'll say it again. I think culture is the most, for me anyway, it had the most impact. And again, I probably discovered that 3 years before I retired. So for the 30 years before that, I just wish I'd latched onto that, because that would have hopefully made my career even more successful than it was. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, you're all still here, so something must have worked. Right.
So we're going to take a few questions, but what is really interesting in your generation, which is going to suffer actually, is we are shifting
Suffer, I think, is a
towards
strong word.
performance contracting. So that means the building they need to operate as designed. And there is a huge actually gap, energy performance gap that is well established, but what is coming up is indoor environmental quality gap. And industry will be actually struggling how to respond to that, and I'm not sure that academics have the answers on all these questions as well. So there is already British government, and it's on the government contract. It's called energy performance contracting. So people, they can download and they can go. My understanding, uptake of this energy performance contracting is not very high. That means that actually the cost of your building not operating as designed would be actually burden on designers, basically of the building, of course, construction companies delivering. So it's a really big risk. But what Ian suggested, actually, these kind of financial models also include quite a lot of risks. And it's really challenging. And I really hope if that goes through,
Yes.
actually, and people are willing to sign and commit to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So no one likes to change, especially construction industry. And but your generation will be hit by that, definitely. The reason why I'm saying this, but usually when I talk to middle-aged audience, because I was working for the Department for Education on decarbonization of the school building stock for a while, net zero carbon is not one-off. It's like if you're middle-aged, it's like a long life health condition like diabetes. So basically, you hit the targets in terms of your glucose, but you need to manage basically over time. So it can be net zero carbon one day, the next day it can go in a different direction. That is the problem with net zero carbon buildings. It's not about design only, it's not about construction only, it's not about, and what British industry actually, it's really, really bad, commissioning actually, and then you need also to operate. So it's a really complex.
Well, that's why. Yeah, I agree with that entirely. That's why the consortium is such a good idea, because, and that's why I think the client will welcome it, because it ties everybody in for the long run. And actually, as I say, I had a really interesting meeting with a heat pump manufacturer. They actually love that, because the more, they are pushed away from a building when they install it. Actually, they really welcome the idea of being there, because that's the way they learn, and that's the way they optimize their machines. So it would be a great bit of feedback for them.
So up to now, the question always, where is money coming for monitoring operational performance?
Yeah.
No one wanted to pay for it.
Yeah.
But now having this kind of consortium, basically they will take all responsibility.
Well, again, interestingly enough, we were brave enough to go and talk to, a little old firm like Hoare Lea, as engineers, went to the market, the big city, and said, we've got this idea. It would involve some money, would you be interested in that? They all said, 100%. The only proviso is you don't borrow a small amount of money. We want to give you tens of millions, not 10 million.
Yeah.
And all they're after is a return, 4%, whatever it is, 5%. And I'm pretty sure the economics will work out. And the client's clever enough to, I keep saying to the university, you're not going to get decarbonisation for nothing. You'll pay for it, but you'll pay for it on a monthly basis.
Yeah. Which is a win-win situation because all universities are cash strapped, including
Yes.
Oxford and Cambridge.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Definitely.
Questions? Yes.
Of the projects you worked on in your career, what percentage would you say were new build as opposed to retrofit designs?
That's a very interesting question. So I would probably say that 80% new build.
With the net zero target, it's obviously targeting retrofits. What do you think will happen to the new build market as a result of that? Will we see a lot of new builds still happening? Or will engineers and architects focus be forced to be pushed into the retrofitting side?
Again, that's a really, really good question. I wish I'd covered that in my talk because several strands to that. So first of all, it worries me a little bit that the people who've got I don't know what, just change the subject slightly. Did anybody see that report that came out last week or the week before about the state of solid wall insulation that had been, basically the government funded loads of people to put solid wall insulation into their houses to reduce their energy costs. They pay for the insulation. You think a win-win. Everybody gets lower heating bills. The industry is pump primed and there's lots of people putting insulation in. Turns out that actually the whole thing was badly managed and people were giving the wrong advice to put the wrong insulation in the wrong place, and the quality of the building was reduced dramatically because the advice was wrong. Switch that back to climate change. The people with all the knowledge is the people in that consortium. All of their effort is focused on new build, more or less. The economics just don't work for refurbishments, which is so frustrating. And I have this worry that if the people who are the best at doing that, that's all the people in the consortium, that's professional architects and engineers and contractors, if they don't do it, then it'll be the same set of people that are doing solid wall insulation, and we'll limp across to the target in 2050, and then we'll discover that the heat pumps don't really work, or it was never really suitable for a heat pump to go into a Victorian terrace building in anywhere, and that's a very real worry. So somehow or other, we've got to replumb the industry so that all the right people with the knowledge are focused on 99% of those 20 plus million buildings are refurbs. Yet all of the industry's knowledge is focused on the 1%, which is new builds. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's what I worry about. And I don't know why it's not doing that, but it just isn't. We had an interesting conversation at that show and tell meeting where we were all moaning at each other in Oxford, and one of the academics said, because we broke down into little tables, and I was on a table with actually a very interesting professor who runs if you get a moment, you could Google the UCL Institute in Oxford, which is about low carbon change in buildings. And he was saying, he genuinely asked, how much of the question you asked, how much of your attention is focused on refurbs? And we all sort of looked at our feet and decided not to answer. And it was almost nothing. And he asked why, and there were architects and engineers and clients and QSs around the table. We just couldn't, there's no logical reason for it. It's just the way, it was a little bit like what I said before. We all know what it's like to tender for a new build, so we tender for that because that's what we did yesterday and we think we'll do that tomorrow. It's frustrating.
There is a little bit of cultural change. So you go to Westminster City Council, so they refuse to give a permission for 2 new buildings on Oxford Street. So one is Marks and Spencer flagship store, 1920s. They wanted to knock down and to build a new one. It was rejected based on embodied carbon. And the second one, it was probably you're too young. You don't remember a department store called Debenhams. It has a huge shop actually on Oxford Street. That has been also declined, rejected based on embodied carbon. So I think more and more we are going to see this major retrofit projects.
definitely.
Because embodied carbon, and be aware, this is engineering rule of thumb, so it's not always correct. It's mostly 60% actually of the total carbon emission during the whole life cycle of one building. So it's the shift towards retrofit probably is going to happen.
The other way of saying the same thing, if you think about it, is, you know, as I say, 20 million buildings to be done in 25 years. That's a lot. That's almost a million a year. If you think about the new build, that's probably about, I don't know, the equivalent number every year that's completed might be, off the top of my head, 1,000, maybe 2,000. So, and all the people who are competing, you know, the people in that consortium, all competing for that 2,000, they're all complaining there's too many architects, too many designers, fees are too low. You know, they're pointing in the wrong direction. They should be pointing over there where the market is much bigger, yet we still haven't done that. Sorry. There's a question here at the front, Diane as well.
Oh, sorry. I do apologize. Yeah.
Whoever, sorry, I think you put your hand up first.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be quick, I'm sorry. So, a lot of your projects were based in Oxford, and that's quite a historic city.
Yeah.
The university owns a lot of very, very historic buildings.
Yeah.
Very listed buildings. How do they navigate the sort of quite strong tension of having sort of obviously quite a lot of scientific and academic research going on in what are very, very old buildings a lot of the time, and very protected buildings?
Yeah.
Does that come up as a...
It does. It's a point of tension all the time. And rightly so, I think, because I mean, it's interesting. Lots of people actually love to work in really rubbish old buildings, you know, where lots of science is done in buildings where you wouldn't think that scientists would ever want to work, but because it's a lovely old building and it's got a leaky window and the lights don't really work, they actually get their best science done. There's also a lot of people who, you know, the sort of 20th century society and planners and all that sort of stuff, who actually, rightly so, want to restrict what you can do on your buildings in that listed category. I think it's a challenge that is, I wouldn't say it's unique to Oxford, but you know, Cambridge may be the same, and maybe even UCL as well. I think that's why the bill is $750 million, because it's really challenging. A lot of the maths, physics, and life science buildings are generally they're not all of them, but a lot of them are new builds. So I think our place to start would be on the new builds. You know, we've got the Central Chemistry building in Oxford is, I don't know, 7 stories, probably about 150,000 square feet, if that means anything to you. And I think it's their biggest energy consumer, and it's a 24/7 building. And on Christmas Day afternoon, it uses exactly the same amount of energy as it does when all the students are there.
Is that the atmospheric, the sort of temperature control for the lamps and stuff like that? Is that,
yeah. And you know, researchers think that's why, you know, I should have said that decarbonising a building should be done with you as a user, not on you, and that's the problem. So a lot of the scientists in chemistry, they convince themselves they need the fume hoods to run all the time, and they leave them on. Probably if they understood what that meant, then they could be persuaded not to. Or there's a workaround that they didn't have to do that all the time.
Can I ask, did you work on the Penrose building? The maths one? It's right behind the Blavatnik School of Government.
Oh yes, yes, we did that. That was a
lovely building.
Yes, Or in fact, all of the buildings on that site we did, yeah. So you know that building?
Yeah, I was there for 4 years.
All right, yeah.
I was like, oh, I spot my building.
All right.
On your slides.
Right, yeah, okay. Sorry.
I think it's related kind of to both of your questions. So in terms of like specifically the UK, do you feel like in construction companies or in general in the future, is there going to be more of a balance between keeping the old building facade and the old building look to actually starting to change it? Because I understand from my point of view, there's so much focus on newer buildings because you have all the freedom that you want, right?
Yeah.
But when you work with older buildings, I guess it depends on each country's legislation, like how much they're trying to protect it, what is their main point of view.
Yeah.
Because I feel like here it's a very much focus on facade, try not to change much.
Yeah.
But I do believe that in other countries, for instance, they do permit, of course, companies who are professional in like historical refurbishments, but to start changing a bit, like to start working properly on the insulation, on the windows, on the actual materials that are in it. Do you feel like that would happen in the UK, or that's maybe why sometimes the progression towards more sustainable designs is a bit slower?
Again, another very interesting question. How to answer that? I would say, going back to my earlier point about the fact that I can't really understand why people focus on new builds rather than refurbs. I think a lot of that is the power of architects. So architects, you mentioned, new build is like a clean slate. They can do whatever they want, and a lot of architects are still focused on that. They're focused on. I mean, I'm almost embarrassed by saying it, but if architects, perhaps I shouldn't say that, but in my experience, architects are interested in buildings, they're interested in awards, and they're interested in the occupants, in that order. Really painful to say it, but it's true. So they see a commission as an ability to do something that's interesting. Actually, if you stop and think about it, why on earth would we ever knock any building down and start again? You know, why would you not refurbish everything? There's a few issues there. There's change of use, for example. So a laboratory which is maybe looking at, say, a 4 metre floor-to-floor height, obviously wouldn't work in a building that had a 3.6 metre or 3 metre floor-to-floor height. So there's some buildings where, you know, you can't put a laboratory into an old school, for example, but you could put an office in an old school, and you could put a school in an old office. So there are certain things you can do. In academia, in the world of universities, going back to the point about they don't have much money, there's quite a lot of academic buildings that are funded by benefactors. So nearly all of the buildings on the site you mentioned in Oxford are funded by people that give a fat load of money to have a building named after them. And if you are a billionaire living in New York and you want to stamp your authority on Oxford, like I can't remember the name of the guy who runs BlackRock, I think, big investment organisation, has just funded a humanities building in Oxford, 200 million, maybe 250 million. Is he really going to want to spend 250 million on refurbishing 5 old buildings? Or does he want a brand new flagship, lovely building that's got a great facade, you know, big lecture theatre, all that sort of stuff? It's a difficult nut to crack. You know, it's a complex thing. You know, change, as I say it all the time. Change is really difficult, and it's not like a switch. You can't just you think, oh, that's it, and change will happen. It's very complex. So I think we will inevitably move towards more refurbishment, which is great. And it's great for the planet, and it's actually great for engineers and probably architects as well, because you're really challenged in terms of what you can do in a refurb. And I think the legislation side of your question, it will have to move. It will move a bit. You know, I don't want all the historic buildings in Oxford to not look like they do now. I want them all to be just as attractive from the outside and from the inside, but I want them to be more efficient. And I think there's a lot of, you know, interestingly enough, one of the academics I spoke to at Oxford, he was talking about a sort of a super insulating paint that could go on the inside of a solid wall that could have a massive impact on its U value. It was all sort of double Dutch to me, but you know, so there's technological advances all the time which will allow that sensitive refurbishment of existing buildings to happen more successfully, I think. But there will always be the requirement to have a new build. You know, if you need we did a stupid example, but we did a big sort of space research building where they were testing satellites, and it needed to be, 16 meters high. Now you're not going to find a refurb for that, so there will be an inevitable amount of new build, but much more refurbishment, I think, definitely.
you have a change in England in terms of conservation of buildings. So for example, quite a lot of school building stock is grade 1 or grade 2 listed buildings. So English Heritage actually wrote an article about schools fit for the future, because you had a lot of problems for grade 1 listed buildings, schools not being able to replace windows, because it has to be the same material, which is wood, the same sash windows. They're huge, so they didn't have money to do it. So quite a few head teachers actually replaced with UPVC, double glazed, and they were almost taken to the court. But then the government stepped in, and English Heritage made a compromise. So that even conservation thinking in England actually is changing towards effectiveness and sustainability. So everyone is becoming much more flexible. Wilkins building, it's a nightmare to operate. That is a grade 1 listed building. We can't touch anything from the outside nor inside. And even if you replace, it has to be even the same mechanism and the same way that it's made as it was before. So actually just finding, and actually the building, the Houses of Parliament, when it was refurbished, there are a few nice articles how much it cost actually, just because it's a grade 1 listed building.
We're actually on that project. We're on that project, and the bill is astronomical.
Yes,
absolutely enormous.
So apparently tiles on the floor, they were selling actually the original ones, bits and pieces, if you want to keep it, but they needed to make the new ones using the same mechanism, the same kilns as it was done 200 years ago. So it was really
silly, really.
Silly,
yeah.
really. Yes. So approach to English conservation actually is changing basically as we speak. Next question. Yeah. Okay. Good.
I've got 2 questions actually.
Okay.
So you talked about something being for good clients getting good buildings. Can you define what good clients are like? I'm just curious to know, how do you describe good buildings?
That's actually a very good question. I should have expanded that, but I was conscious of it at the time. So good buildings for me would be, how would I describe them? I would describe them, I mean, at the basic concept level, you're designing and building a building for its users. So if that is a school, you want the building to contribute towards the ability for the students to gain a better education. If you're designing a healthcare building, you want the building, rightly so, to contribute towards the patient being healed in as quickly and effective a possible way. So good could mean that. So fit for purpose, delivering what it's been designed and built for. It could also mean being built on budget. It could also mean being aesthetically pleasing and being very welcome and people happy to be in. It's a combination of all of those things, I think. It's interesting that the opposite of that, when I said that, I didn't almost say it. I didn't quite say it, but bad clients get bad buildings. There are very few bad buildings in my experience, but what I mean is the opposite of good is that it didn't quite deliver what it could have done if the process had been done in the correct way. Does that help?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe you mean like the process wouldn't be as smooth as.
Well, I found in my career it's quite useful to try and focus, to bring everything back to a personal level. So if you, I mean, I know not many of you are homeowners because of the state of the country and all, but if you had your own house and you wanted to extend it, and you were looking for a designer and a builder, why would you not choose the one that you felt you could engage with, you could influence positively, you could have a great cultural alignment in terms of how the process is going to operate and how to ensure that when they've all gone and you've got your extension, it's broadly exactly as you wanted it to be. And that the whole process, because building and building is really messy and it takes a long time. The whole process was done in a sort of a respectful and enjoyable way. That's what I would be looking for if I was a client. And I struggle with the fact that not many clients ever ask that of me. They just give me a brief to say, we want a building that's got these rooms in it and it needs to be no more than £30 million and I want it by February 2027. Very poor brief, really, in a way. And
unless you have the ability to engage with the client and say, really, do you want that? You know, why have you not considered a refurbishment, for example? If you get that process going, where all of the people in your team are engaged with you in an open and mutual trust-based way, then I definitely believe you get the better outcome. And conversely, if you don't get that, it's not that you get a bad outcome, but you get an outcome that perhaps wasn't as good as it could have been, if you see what I mean.
Second question, what does an engineering consultant do on a day-to-day basis?
Lots of things. So when I started, it was, it was back in the day. So what does a consulting engineer do? Well, so I was, if you think about this room, so the architect the client would have said we need a classroom for 26 people. And it needs to be next to some toilets and next to an ante-room or whatever, so the architect would sort of do the blocking and block layout of the thing. Then oversimplifying it, the engineer or the MEP engineer would then do everything that inside this room that controlled the environment. So the lighting, how much lighting, what light levels you need to be a successful classroom, how should that light, in fact this room isn't very good, but how should the light be on the working plane rather than in your eyes, and where I'm sat, it's absolutely definitely in my eyes. And what ventilation do you have? Are there openable windows ideally? If not, is there any mechanical ventilation? Where should it come in? In this room, I think it comes in from the ceiling. I've seen some grills on the ceiling. Maybe that's wasn't as effective as bringing it in from the floor, example. What's the acoustics like between this foldable partitions? Because obviously, if somebody's next door and you're in here and you're giving a confidential lecture, you don't want that to. So it's a combination of all of those things, really. And we would be given that task, we would inherit that task, and we would be doing all of that in collaboration with the architect who was then designing the room. So make sure those two things knitted together. And the architect would be looking at colours, floor finishes, furniture, and then the structural engineer would be making it all stand up. So that's broadly what we do.
Coordination of everything together.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that, if you're not in the industry, it's quite difficult to understand, but literally everything in this room, every single thing you see, had been designed several years before it's been built. So everything has to work. Where the light switches are, which annoyingly don't work in this room, but where the floor boxes are, so you can get the power out to where the desks are going to go, what the frame is on that window, how it's going to be opened, all of that has to be thought through and designed before anything's here, because once you're in the process of building a building, it just has to be built. If you sort of turn up and say, I don't know those lights, well, you can't change it then. And that's the challenge, and also the real thrill. This room is quite complex, but if you think about a huge laboratory where everything has to be designed to the millimetre, it's great. It's so powerful to be able to hold that in your hands and to influence all of that.
Do consulting engineers in that case specialize or generalize?
Do you mean that's a good question, Nishesh. I spent most of my career as a generalist, and I really enjoyed that because, as I say, 20 different sectors. So when you design a hotel, the whole driving force is totally different from a laboratory. In a hotel, the number one thing you've got to get right is hot water. If you pay for a hotel and you don't get any hot water, it's the end. So as an MEP engineer, the one thing you focus on is hot water, making sure there's lots of it. In a laboratory, at the other end of the spectrum, we did I don't know whether you know the Beecroft building, the physics building in Keble Triangle. But we were doing some research on, the scientists were doing some research on quantum computers where you're trying to capture molecules. And the vibration of a bus, quarter of a mile away, in the centre of Oxford, would influence the experiment. So if you think about all of the services that go inside that building, they all had to be designed in a way so that no vibration would be, that was a hugely complex thing. And to be able to do that, you need to get some very, very specialist knowledge. So our people, the Hoare Lea people, will reinforce with some external specialists. But I also think, going back to my example about when I was sort of influential in growing the science area, it's quite science sector for Hoare Lea. It's very difficult to be knowledgeable enough to sit alongside the client in multiple different sectors. You can't really be a real expert in hotels and then the next day be a real expert to prisons or science or teaching or healthcare. To a certain extent, you need specialist knowledge. My worry is that we confine people's development too early, and that as a graduate +1, you're into healthcare, and that's all you do, because it's just not interesting enough. The worst sector for everybody in design is residential. Literally everybody hates residential because it's just 100,000 square boxes. What's the design challenge there? So, generalist as much as you can, but then it's very helpful to get specialist knowledge and also be a specialist in an area that you really enjoy. I love labs because I love the clients. So why would I not do that?
So you mentioned a very good training. That is something that they should be looking for.
Yeah.
So how training looks like in Hoare Lea? Do they go a little bit in the lighting team, a little bit in...
Yes, they do. I mean, I would say that I left 5 years ago, so I don't really know. I don't know what definitely is happening now, but it was definitely like a rotational thing. So you spend 3 months in sustainability, working with a sustainability group, and then into lighting. I started off as a mechanical engineer. I almost ended up doing lighting for some reason. I can't quite remember why, but I didn't. But the training has to be a little bit over a broad area, because that creates the best engineer, I think.
Any other question? Okay.
When you were explaining, you said that for funding, 20% comes from the energy saving and 70% that you have to borrow.
Yeah.
Is it from the banks or?
Yes. Maybe not the banks, actually. My son's actually, he does a job which I don't really understand, which is a very old, old people say that, so I'm sorry I've said it, but he's close to finance in terms of, he sort of advises deals and whatever, so, he's told me on multiple levels that the world is awash with money, literally, there's so much money that rich people are giving to organisations, funders, venture capitalists, whatever. I've got this money, do something with it and give me a return. Just give me 5%, because if I stick it in a bank, I only get 3%, so why would I lose out? So there's so much money flowing around, mostly from the US, China, Far East, Middle East, less Middle East now, mostly US, China and Far East. And there's a lot of that trying to find somewhere where there's a return. And things are, 5 years ago it was, in the UK, it was film studios. Somebody said there's going to be a massive uptake in film studios, film production. There's a shortage of film studios. They're just basically big sheds with lots of sound insulation around them. We'll build loads of those. And there was loads of money flowing in. We did loads and loads and loads, still doing loads of studios. And then that market dropped because there was too many studios. And then the current market is data centres. Everybody wants to build data centres. So the money comes from, it's not necessarily a bank, it's an individual or a group of individuals that finds a funding body to basically trust them to deliver that profit, and then they pile money in. And as I say, there's a huge amount of money in that, which is great for the industry because of course it needs that. And if you think about Diane's our discussion about decarbonisation, wouldn't it be great if effectively the wealthy people of the world actually put the money up to fund some of that decarbonisation? And okay, they get a return from it, but at least it shifts the dial and we get something done. So I've got no sort of qualms about that. But that's where I think the money comes from.
And then when I was working, I heard the term called ESCO companies. Like,
oh yeah.
they spend their own money in a building when they do an energy audit, and then they do the retrofit with their money, and they will take the profit in terms of the return on investment from the building.
Yeah.
Have you ever worked with any of the ESCO
I
companies?
personally haven't. I think Hoare Lea has. I mean, the model that I said.
The consortium?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's almost an ESCO, but
Oh, yeah. That's
but
what-
I don't like. I much, as I said, as you probably recognise, culture is my biggest thing. So I think it needs to be called a culturally led consortium, because that's much flatter. ESCO sounds like there's somebody at the top of the ESCO that's making the money, and part of the money they make is by beating up all the other people down the supply chain. And we are absolutely the opposite of that. Interestingly enough, so going back to construction and constructors, Laing O'Rourke, you probably know the name Laing O'Rourke, they're probably the most high-profile builder in the UK. Family-run firm, been around for a long, long time. I think they have a turnover of £1 billion a year. So every year they build £1 billion worth of stuff. And that could be, in fact, most of the buildings in Oxford are built by Laing O'Rourke. You know, they're really, really complicated, high-level things. Full of risk. Anything could go wrong. They found lots of groundwater in the ground. I don't know, there's some problem with the supply chain, there's a recession, some of their specialists go bust, whatever. Absolutely stuffed to the gunnels with risk. Going back to my earlier discussion about venture capitalists they just want 4 or 5%. If you ask Laing O'Rourke what a good year looks like, they are absolutely cock-a-hoop if they make 1%. 1% on £1 billion, full of risk. The way they top that up is all of the supply chain below Laing O'Rourke are beaten up over contractual terms, over payment terms, over the price. So this is why my consortium is so powerful, because a lighting manufacturer that might have provided those lights had absolutely no voice at all in anything. At the end of the day, he was selected because he was the cheapest. And does that make this room the best? It doesn't, does it? It's just ridiculous. And everybody knows that goes on, and nobody will change it. Because if you're Laing O'Rourke, and I think Laing O'Rourke are fantastic, but there's no other alternative for them to make a decent return other than to beat up their supply chain. But that's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And there's thousands of reports, Egan and Latham, and for years people have been saying that's wrong. And it still happens, which is one of the reasons why Grenfell Tower happened. It was exactly the same. And we all know that was the wrong, terrible disaster, shouldn't have happened, but somebody's got to change that system. Tomorrow has got to be different from today. Next.
You mentioned before when you were talking about what a consulting engineer does, and you talked about in different stages the architect comes in and blocks out maybe the areas, and then you might come in and talk about the atmospheric or the environment inside the building. I don't know, maybe previously that was done quite separately. Have you found that over the years, maybe with more focus on decarbonisation, those conversations have come a little bit closer together? I'm thinking of the SSES, which is, I think, about 5 minutes away from this building, where the sort of the architecture is constructed in order to facilitate passive ventilation, things like that.
Definitely,
have you found this progress, or is it still very much
No. Again, a very good question. I would say I mentioned, I don't know whether you were in the room when I mentioned that bit, but no. One of the things that I was struck by in my career, that the lack of self-confidence of designers, particularly MEP engineers and structure engineers, to be honest. When I joined in the 80s, the king of the whole pile was the architect. And they were generally Joe Bloggs architects. So there was a Joe Bloggs who was the king of the kings. He used to turn up and he used to control everything. And what happened then is that a client would engage, they would have some sort of patronage with Joe Bloggs. And then the client would say, "Oh, Joe, I'm thinking of designing a school. Oh, I can do this one." Create that, client say yes, and then the architect would go to the structural engineer and say, "Make that work for me."
Yeah.
And structurally would say, well, there's no columns. Yeah, how are we going to do that?
There's no
And then
pipes.
lastly, they would pass it to the MEP engineer and say, can you fit all the boilers and the chillers and the lights in that design? And that was commonplace, and that's what I inherited when I joined. I would say that's all gone.
Okay.
The power now is with the clients and with the money people. The architects generally have lost power. I wouldn't say lost, ceded power. That's a much softer way of saying it. It is now much more of a collaborative process. Obviously, that's a generalisation. There are some architects who behave in the old-fashioned way, literally still, which is very, very annoying. In fact, the maths building was very much like that. The architect was unbelievably difficult to deal with.
He doesn't
No.
represent them.
No, he was American. He used to fly in. He used to do a world tour. He used to go around all the projects in the globe, and he used to land in Oxford, and he used to insist on a meeting on that day, and then he'd sit there like a king and would preside over the meeting. It was unbelievably painful. But anyway,
I'm sorry to bring that building.
no. I've got a scar. I'll get it. But most projects are designed in a very collaborative way. But as I say, when you get that cultural bit right, there seems to be some sort of magic source that makes that even more powerful.